All right, to other news now. And despite the promises, the coalition government is spending more than it pledged. That's the takeaway after the government's books were opened. The finance minister admitted it's sobering reading. The books remain in the red, with the country's deficit now almost $13 billion. Revenue is up, but it's not enough to close the gap. Debt has gone up by nearly $20 billion to $175 billion, taking it to 42.5% of GDP.
I was actually thinking as we go through, Craig, should we stop and do you want to just speak to these as we're going through? So it's gone up by, how much did it say? Another 45 billion?
So debt went up by $20 billion.
Right.
Debt has risen to 40, as it is in the graphic, 42.5% of GDP. Now that sounds like a lot of money, and it is. However, if we were having this same conversation in the UK, that figure would be 100%.
Wow. So their debt is 100% of their GDP?
Correct. If we were having this conversation in the US, the debt figure would be somewhere in the order of 125, 130% GDP.
Yeah.
If we're having a conversation in Japan, that debt figure will be 270% GDP. So it's very much a case of it's high by New Zealand standards, or it's higher by New Zealand standards, but New Zealand standards are very, very low. We don't have a debt crisis in New Zealand. We have lots of other crises. We have a crisis of investment, a crisis of infrastructure, a crisis of confidence in this government, but we don't have a public debt crisis. There's no suggestion that our debt problems are any issue at all.
Yeah. Okay. So answer me this then. We're at 42.5% of GDP. You're saying that's a pretty good result. What are some countries that are a better result than us? Are there many that are also like 40%, 30%, 35%, 20%?
No, I mean, even Australia has a higher debt to GDP ratio than us. The countries that tend to have lower debt to GDP ratios are countries which have historically had, like Switzerland. That there are some countries that have very low debt to GDP ratios because in the past they've been burned by debt, and so they make a thing of reducing debt to GDP ratios. Then there are some jurisdictions that have very low debt to GDP ratios. I'm sort of thinking here, Niger, Chad, Sudan, which have lower debt to GDP ratios simply because nobody will lend them any money.
You're right.
So it's a real it's a real mixed bag. But New Zealand's debt is absolutely no problem, and that's reflected in the fact that during COVID, the Crown's credit rating went up. We're one of the only countries in the world where people were more keen to lend to us during COVID. Where else in the world?
Hang on. So we got better. Gee, thanks, Jacinda. Isn't that what we're supposed to say at the end of that? Something like that?
Yeah. We're one of the few countries in the world that was the case. Yeah.
Speaking of that, though, $20 billion debt, more debt under this government. My understanding is under John Key's government, debt went up by approximately $50 billion. Under Labor, approximately $25 billion, far less than under John Key, funnily enough. But Labor seems to get the lion's share of them the country being put into debt by a certain sector, and these guys are already taken up by $20 billion. So that means they're at a similar level to what Labor did in their full term with COVID. Is that correct-ish?
Well, so Nicola, or Miss Willis rather, would say that some of these accounts reflect the first few months or the last few months of Labour government. So she would say that not the full year for her. To be frank, it's good practice amongst economists when we're talking about debt, particularly public debt, to actually not talk about the nominal figure, so the 175 or the 150 billion, because it's actually a fairly meaningless figure. You should always concentrate on the debt to GDP figure. And again, our debt to GDP isn't a big issue. It rose last year, didn't rise a huge amount, and there's still a huge amount of headroom should we need to borrow more money in case of a natural disaster or something else.
It actually, when you say it's pretty good. When you say comparing to, say, for example, our counterparts, the Americans, the Australias, the UKs, it's pretty fucking awesome, to be honest.
Yep. So if you compare ourselves to countries like Canada, where that figure will be much higher, it's 60-odd%. If you compare yourself to the UK, to the US, it's higher in Germany, which has had a historically stronger economy for a really long period of time. If we're having this conversation in Italy, it will be somewhere in the order of 150, 160% GDP. It's actually more important who you owe the money to, rather than actually the amount of money. Because if you owe the money to, well, we generally speaking owe the money to international money markets, which is generally speaking big Australian banks, because they're wrapped up in investment portfolios. We owe some money in euro markets and some money in Japan, but not enormous amounts. Italy has a very high debt to GDP ratio, but most of its debt is owed to Italians. So it basically owes it to itself. It's a much more stable form of debt than if all of your debt is owned by foreigners and they demand that debt in their own currency. All New Zealand debt is denominated in its own currency, and so therefore we're not likely to default on our debt.
I love it that we've played 25 seconds of the video and we've spoken for 5 minutes so far. That feels very BHN. Emily, do you want to ask anything from your worldview at the moment? Me and Emily had a bit of a chat before and she goes like, oh, the economy is not my strong suit, but lots of people, economy is not what they understand. Is there anything from your perspective that we're going to keep going with the video as well, but that you want to ask of Craig?
I think you've answered most of the questions that I had. And the things I was looking up was trying to figure out what the whole debt ratio thing is, or what it actually looks like, that 42%, and then looking at other countries and seeing how high it is. What would you start to freak out about? Like if you saw it jump up to 20% in a year, would that freak you out? Or what's scary? It's
what are you spending it on?
Yeah.
So if it rose 20% in a year because there was a natural disaster, or because we suddenly had a global pandemic, or because we suddenly had to, find money to pay for social services in our place overnight, you'd buy that. That's not a problem. It's if you spend it and you don't have anything for it, you don't get anything for it, that's when it becomes a real problem.